Good afternoon or evening, depending on what side of the pond you're on, and welcome to another special episode of Across the Pitch, where we have Jonathan Hibberd joining us to talk about the Belarus Premier League. The past 2 weeks, we have kind of focused on Isloch. This week, we're going to kind of take a look at the whole table from top to bottom here and some of the interesting stories that are going on over there as we head into a break this weekend. So welcome back to the show, Jonathan.
Hi, Phil. Dobry wieczór. So, I'm just going to pick up on what I think are the big themes, and I think Belarus is kind of in its way quite an interesting place as well. So there's a whole context to what's going on. So the first game we had was Neyman against Belshina. That was Belshina's first point of the season, so they get off the mark. Neyman scored a great free kick in that game, so that's well worth seeing. I think Neyman's stadium was the most empty I've seen. So that was a place where people really kind of do seem to be staying away. And if I can, I just want to sort of chuck in a bit of history, because
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because one of the interesting thing about Belarus is that the borders that exist now, of course, as in a lot of Europe, are not the borders that existed in the past. So a lot of these cities, they were in Poland between the world wars, and some of them even had totally different names. Okay. So
Belarus was part of the former Soviet Union, and then one of the 13 countries that broke off from it, correct?
Yeah. But the Soviet Union moved kind of west after World War II and became bigger and absorbed more places. There's a couple of interesting stories that have come out of this. One team, which I probably won't talk much about, the team that nobody seems to want out of the kind of English language supporters clubs, is Ruch Brest, okay, which were founded in 2016 as a kind of B team of Dynamo Brest, but because they had won the second division, they wanted to go up. Basically, they were able to do that by severing the link and becoming a sort of separate club. But curiously, they have the date 1922 on their logo, and I was like, where did that come from? And it comes from apparently an old Polish football club when the city used to be called Brześć, if I can say it right. And they just kind of resurrected it as a kind of tribute to the city's football history. Okay. And so the old border ran right down the middle of the country, and that tends to mean, the same in Ukraine, it tends to mean there are actually different attitudes slightly in different parts of the country. So Neyman, for example, is right up between the borders of Lithuania and Poland. And so they tend to kind of think of themselves as a bit more Western, a bit more European. And that would kind of figure that maybe they're a bit closer to the kind of advice on COVID-19 that's being given in more Western countries, because they really did look like they were staying away. But after my brief history lesson, I think
that's very interesting. I actually really brings a lot of light to, because I think one of the big things that the folks over here maybe don't realize is that different parts of the world there are such different ways of thinking, and that could really play out in something like why one league decides to play and another doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also plays out with language, because in Belarus, you've actually got two languages. Most people speak Russian, but there is actually a Belarusian language. And the crazy thing is, you never quite know which one you're going to meet. So a lot of fans, I think, have found themselves stumbling upon league tables and lists of fixtures with a different spelling to the one that they'd already seen. So Neyman, the Twitter account, tweets in Belarusian rather than Russian, which I think is quite nice, actually. And the name of the cities is Grodno in Russian, but Hrodno in Belarusian. So we could go on. But they have a friendship with Jagiellonia, which is a Polish team just across the border as well. So I think there's a lot of kind of potential fan interest in that part of the world. So the three...
One thing I did want to kind of go back to real quick is I thought of a kind of an analogy of this is so you say that Rue Brest was like the B team for Dynamo Brest, so that we don't have relegation and promotion, of course, over here in the United States, but say that we did. The perfect example would be that last season, Real Salt Lake and Real Monarchs. So Real Salt Lake is an MLS team. And Real Monarchs are their number 2 team, their B team that play in the second tier of the USL. They actually won the USL championship last season. So it would be like if Real Monarchs won the USL championship, then they would have to sever their ties with Real Salt Lake to join MLS, that type of thing.
Yeah, the other US example that it reminded me of is, I forget whose B team it is, but they've resurrected Bethlehem Steel, haven't they?
Yes.
And that also is kind of looking back to kind of football history and stuff. So it's a bit the same idea, I think. But like I said, they haven't attracted much of a following so far. So we had what you could say is the top of the table clash between Torpedo and Energetic. I think the main thing to say about that was absolutely make sure that you've seen the second goal in that game. Brazilian Gabriel Ramos has hit it from long range with very little backlift. So that was a really, really good goal. So those are the kind of, I would say the two overachievers, and Torpedo kind of won the battle of the overachievers and a top. But Bate and Dynamo Brest have both started hitting form now. So Bate had a very kind of convincing victory away to FC Minsk, and Dynamo Brest they made heavy weather of it in the first half against Isloch. Isloch took the lead with a thumping goal, and Dynamo Brest, equalised with about 20 seconds before half time. So for me, that was really frustrating, of course. But as it went on, I think we've got suspicions with Isloch that apparently they've got the highest average age of any team in the league. And you were starting to see it in this game that in the last 20 minutes, they just seemed a bit off the pace. So in the end, it was quite straightforward as a two-goal margin of victory, which was what I predicted. But
one thing that really surprised me was seeing Dynamo Minsk in 14th. Aren't they usually one of the better teams?
Yeah, that was the next thing I was going to come on to. I think the third big story of the week, or of the league so far, is that just Dynamo Minsk really, really underachieving. I kind of compared them to a kind of Belarusian Leeds United at the moment. A big club, but the results just aren't there. And it was a very, very strange game of theirs away to Gorodea. I've got a little one for any English non-league football aficionados, actually. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of the ground of Lewes FC, which is down near Brighton in England. I'll tweet a link for you if you like.
Okay, yeah, please do.
And their ground is really distinctive because it's got these kind of banks of earth around it where you'd expect there to be stands, And Gorodea's stadium kind of reminded me of that a little bit. The stadium's called, but I don't know if it's the Dripping Pan or the Dripping Pan, if you see what I mean. I'm sure there's someone around that would know. Yeah, so I had kind of memories of that and getting kind of, withdrawal symptoms from English non-league. That was quite nice to see. But I suppose the standout image from that game was a Brazilian player, Danilo, who used to play down in Ukraine for not Shakhtar Donetsk, but Metalurg Donetsk. And he was sent off for a second yellow, got his tracksuit on and basically found a log to sit on next to the goal on his phone, on his mobile. And there were all kinds of there were some quite nice local jokes going around about that he'd got off early so he could cook shashlik, the kind of shish kebabs. So I quite liked that.
So one thing I wanted to kind of go back to is that you compared Dynamo Minsk to Leeds. So is this a situation where they maybe overspent trying to get into the Europa League and didn't make it, and now they're paying for that kind of thing?
It could be. I mean, I'm not really qualified to say. I mean, they were in Europe at the start of, when I say this season, I'm talking about the European season, not the Belarusian season.
Right.
But the early rounds, it kind of feeds into also a really interesting kind of discussion stroke argument that I got into over the weekend about the standard of the league, actually, because it's kind of difficult to know what to compare it to. But yeah, so Dynamo Minsk, they were in Europe in the early rounds. They struggled to get past Derry City of Ireland.
Okay, so, yeah, actually, I'm familiar with them, actually.
Yeah, it's a great club, actually. So, I'm not really qualified to say, but yeah, definitely they've got probably the four.
The only reason I ask is because you mentioned Leeds, and of course, everybody knows the story of Leeds, and I was wondering if it followed that same narrative, and that's why you had made the comparison. But
I think it is the pitfall because they are as I saw, they're the fourth biggest spenders in the league, and I think a club like that, kind of in a league like that, wages its season on getting into Europe. Yeah, I mean, that was certainly the case when I used to watch Dynamo Kiev, and really, it was all about Europe because that was the real kind of elite level contest. Right, the domestic league didn't give them that. So yeah, I think it could be a fair analogy to make. But we'll see how the season goes on. It's only been 4 games. So,
of course. I mean, they're in 14th, but they're only 6 points off of first. So.
Well, there you go. Yeah, we're kind of trying to make as much of a drama from this as we can because it's the only European football, So I should mention Slutsk against Vitebsk. So that was 1-1. Really, really nice footwork in Vitebsk's goal in that game, actually, in their nice Portugal-style away kit. But Slutsk are warming to their international fan base. So they had a Slutsk Worldwide banner installed in the stadium, like a kind of semi-permanent thing, and an Australia flag, which I know will have pleased a lot of people. So
I'm sure our co-host Aaron Ayers, who's from Australia, will like to hear that.
yeah, exactly. So I think the Slutsk army were reasonably happy with a point from that game. So Smolovici still struggling. They've got 2 points now. But on the other hand, Shakhtar is quite a big team in this league, so maybe a 0-0 is not too bad. And I suppose the only other game I haven't mentioned is Slavia Mosir. They were on a good run, but came out 0-0. So in terms of next weekend, the big games to look forward to, I think, is probably the last one. As I mentioned to you before we did the podcast,
Shakhtar Slutsk.
I'm looking at Bate against Torpedo, actually. So I think that'll be the biggest game of the weekend. Games are earlier, which will have puzzled a lot of people, but the reason for that is that Orthodox Christians celebrate Easter this year a week later. So there are no games on Sunday because Sunday is Easter. So to finish off, really, I want to get into this kind of point about the standard of the league.
Yeah.
The kind of discussion that we got into.
I've seen that on Twitter, and I think on your poll, my vote was that it was probably around.
Yeah, and I think most people have gone for that. But there were quite wild estimates of how good or bad it was. So some people thought that a couple of those teams might survive in the championship. Other people went down all the way down to Conference South or even college soccer, which I think is kind of absurd. But because bear in mind you've got players that did play in the Ukraine League, which is the 10th best league in Europe. So
it's not going to be that bad too. I'm hearing you name players from Brazil. I see that there was a graphic that was posted on Twitter, players from Ghana. So if the league is attracting international players, to me, that's going to be at least better than the National League or the Conference, because the Conference, there's not very many players who aren't from England there. That's pretty much a strictly domestic league. Once you get into League Two, that's when you start seeing some internationals. So I would think it couldn't be any lower than League Two.
Yeah, well, that's what I thought. Sometimes it does look a bit poor, but I think part of it comes down to the clash of styles, because it's maybe difficult for people that are used to watching football in England or the US. It's maybe difficult to kind of gauge the style, because the style it's a little bit pedestrian, actually. There's quite a lot of attempts to pass and keep the ball. And there have been very, very interesting contests in the past between teams from the kind of British tradition, if we say, and teams from the sort of post-Soviet. I was at a really curious game a few years ago when Dynamo Kiev played Drogheda United of Ireland in the Champions League qualifiers. And Dynamo had won the away game. And in the home game, it was 2-2. And Drogheda came very, very close at the end to knocking them out. And I think part of it was that I've noticed that the kind of post-Soviet teams, they don't like it when a physical team gets into them, because that's not the way they play. That's not what they're used to. So I think you could kind of interpret that kind of slight apparent lack of urgency as maybe a lower standard, and it isn't quite that.
Well, one thing that I knew that I had remembered this, but I wanted to look it up just to be sure, is to keep in mind last season in the Europa League, Arsenal played Bati, and it was played the game that was played in Belarus was actually won by Bati 1-0. When they went back to England, then Arsenal won 3-0 and 3-1 on aggregate. But so they were a team, and these teams from Eastern Europe, I've unfortunately had to watch Arsenal in the Europa League instead of the Champions League for a few years now. And I've been seeing, some of these teams from Eastern Europe, Karabag, Gurbanov's team.
You would have seen Vorskla Poltava, actually, because they played Arsenal in the Europa League season before last, and I took my wife with me. So in terms of, if you look at Bate, last 4 or 5 years in the European leagues, they beat Arsenal once, they beat Bayern Munich once, and I'm thinking, well, if you look at something comparable, like how many times a team from the National League, the conference, beats a team from the Premier League in the FA Cup, it's only about 3 times in the last 30 years,
Right.
So clearly the league is not as bad as some people are saying.
Right, exactly. And I think it's like any other team, or it should be like any other top tier league in Europe, where maybe the top 4 or the top 6 teams are going to be significantly better than the teams that are getting relegated or at the bottom of the table. And I think that's probably what it is. And I don't doubt that whatever team wins the Belarus League in a given year probably could be at least mid-table at the championship, I think.
Yeah, you never know. You never know. And certainly with the money that Bate have been putting in through the years, I'm hearing, actually, if you don't follow him on Twitter, there's a guy really who's been helping us through this kind of minefield, which is Dima Histon. And from the name, you'll guess that he also roots for Histon in English non-league football, who were, quite good 10 years ago, not so good now. But yeah, his account is RUSNLF, which is maybe hard to remember until you remember it's Russia and non-league football.
Oh, yeah, I follow him. Yeah, he's great.
And he did a podcast over the weekend, and he was saying that Barté, apparently, they had been pretty much in sort of cruise control for a few years, and then they had a change of manager. They've had, a few backroom rows, I think, and the situation there is not as settled as it has been. But they also have probably the best stadium in. I mean, the renovated Dynamo Minsk stadium is very, very good as well. But Barté have got sort of state-of-the-art ground that's quite striking. So they put lots of money in, and so you would expect money to yield half-decent results, right, I would say. So yeah, the only other game to look out for, well, not the only other, but I'm kind of interested in who's going to survive. So we have got the relegation 6-pointer already between Belshina and Smolovici. And it's going to, for one of those teams to survive, it's really going to take some endeavor. Again, if you're drawing analogies, I almost look at Belarus as a bit like Wales, okay? If you take all Wales together, imagine that, Belarus used to be Soviet Union. Wales has got like two big clubs, Cardiff and Swansea, slightly smaller clubs, Wrexham and Newport, and then lots of small clubs, yeah? Mm-hmm. So right. You have to imagine a league with all of those teams and tiny little teams like, I don't know, Real or somebody trying to survive in that kind of a league. That would be tough going, wouldn't it? So that's kind of how I look at this. These teams with very small crowds, very little means, and it's going to be kind of interesting to see how they do it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the relegation battles are more interesting than the battles at the top because, just to see, some of these clubs for them to stay up. I mean, it's like when they say, every year that Accrington Stanley stays in League One, it's as good as winning the World Cup.
Absolutely, yeah. There is a reward in supporting, a lower league team that you just don't get if you just wake up one day and say, "Oh, I support Barcelona," you're never really going to experience that.
Exactly.
I think there was a game a few years ago. It was a promotion decider between Brentford and Doncaster Rovers, and it was one of those ones. Either one could have gone up, and Brentford missed a penalty in the last minute. Doncaster run up the other end, score, and get promoted. And somebody just said, to be a Doncaster fan at 10-5 that day, that this is why we do it,
Yeah, oh, exactly. Exactly. It's like we just had Paul Carton on earlier, and he said that, if you win a game in the last minute, there's not a higher high in the sport. If you lose a game in the last minute, there's not a lower low. It's just that one thing where that's the reason that you do all of this for.
Yeah, so hopefully if you're Smolovici, you will have your Doncaster moment or whatever,
Yeah. All right, Jonathan. Well, I really appreciate having you on today, and it was great to go over all of the teams, and it sounds like, at least for the time being, the Belarus League marches on. So we have the break this Sunday, but after the break, we'll plan on checking in again and see how these matches that we just talked about checked out.
That's great. So, spasibo большое. Thank you very much, and talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Enjoyed it as always. Thank you.